Do you guys still want those water glasses? Yeah. Okay. Great. All right. Hello, everyone. Wow, this is awesome. Hi. Hey, Rudy. Welcome to the Council on Global Affairs. My name is Jen Litvak, and I am the Assistant Director of our Next Generation Programming here at the Council. I'm really excited to introduce to you Brittany McGee, who's sitting with me in the front. She's the brand new Next Gen Officer, and all YPs will see her at all YP programming moving forward. So welcome, Brittany. It's exciting to have you here for our first program. I also want to welcome everybody from the Ivy. That's awesome. I know there's a big group of you here, and it's been really great working with your colleagues working on that program. So welcome to our space. A lot of new faces in the room. Welcome. I also want to say what up to our YP ambassadors and thank all of the council's staff that are here that make this event possible. Vanessa, Katie, Rachel, John, Kevin in the back, Kelly. So thank you, everybody. Clearly, I don't have to tell you guys, this is a special election season. The council is a nonpartisan think tank. And so, we really try to elevate the issues and let people make decisions for themselves. That's what we're here to do. We're really fortunate to have with us our survey team to help us weed through the noise because, there is a lot of noise out there. And I am so excited that it is the third and final debate. Thank you, Lord. And we've got this amazing team up here to help us navigate this really tenuous situation, right? Because the issues are important, and even though we're not hearing a lot about them, they're out there, and it's helpful to have some experts to help us, navigate this really bizarre situation that we all find ourselves in. For those of you who are new to the council, our public opinion survey is one of the longest continuous surveys in the world that measures U.S. Public opinion on American engagement abroad. It used to be every 4 years. Now then it was every 2 years, and now it's yearly. The survey was just released last week or 2 weeks ago now in Washington, D.C. in partnership with the Washington Post, hosted at the Wilson Center. And it's called America in the Age of Uncertainty. Quite fitting, I think. We are really lucky to have a powerhouse team that does survey work with partners all over the world, and that team is led by Dina Smeltz, one of our public opinion fellows, and her Dynamo team, Craig Kafura and Carl Friedhoff. Craig joins us as a former fellow at CSIS, and his work has appeared in the National Review, The Diplomat, and Foreign Affairs. Carl, also a fellow here, obviously, on our public opinion team, comes to us after over a decade in Asia, working on public opinion there in Korea, specifically at the ASAN Institute. Carl's work has appeared in publications like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and together they really drive the public opinion work here at the council. So I invite you to take a look at old issues as well. I'm sure they'll talk about sort of trends and how they change over time, but if there's an issue that resonates with you, check it out. There's some really interesting work that you can pull, just a graphic if reading is in your bag. So I just want to thank you all again for being here. Huge thanks again to the folks from the Ivy for joining us. It's really awesome to see you. If after tonight you want some more public opinion conversation or talk on foreign policy moving forward, we are hosting John Kerry October 26th, and we're offering a promotion. Join YP, $100 for a whole year and attend for free. And then the very next day, lunch with these guys for more on our public opinion work, October 27th. And we'll send you guys a note about that, but mark your calendars. One last thing before I turn it over to our speakers is just to run a show for the night. So we're going to have this program now. They will speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then that will move to Q&A with you guys. So any questions you have, write them down, freeze them in your minds. We'll have a team coming around with microphones later, and you guys can pose your burning questions to Craig and Carl. At 7:30, we'll adjourn. There will be pizza, beer, which you already know about, awesome, and salad, whatever, snacks. And so be sure to stay and grab some food because at 8 o'clock starts the final debate. And we'll have the debate up on all of these screens around here. We'll also be utilizing a new thing called Conferences.io, which is a live real-time polling software that we're using. We'll put up the access information during the break, but just be thinking about that later. So again, program ends at 7:30, dinner at 7:30 to 8, and the final round of this circus at 8 o'clock. It's going to be good. So anyways, thank you again for being here. Carl and Craig, take it away.
Thanks, Jen. So we, in the spirit of keeping this a fun and engaging evening, we would like you to ask questions throughout the event. All right, we do not want you to wait until the end. If you see a burning issue that you want to talk about on slide 3, put your hand up. We have microphone runners in the audience. We'll chat right away. We always, we live on questions and discussing them, so we'd like to get into that as soon as we can.
We can certainly talk at you for an entire hour if you want, but it generally goes better if you see something, then please say something. Isn't that a word? So yeah, I think with that, again, we'll just encourage everyone, please ask questions throughout, because it makes it more enjoyable for the audience. It makes it more enjoyable for us as well.
Yeah, it's more fun if we don't have to lecture for an hour. Okay, this is the night of the third and final presidential debate. So before we get into our survey results, I want to talk a little bit about how we got here and kind of where we are right now. We're less than 3 weeks out from the election, so where are the polls? Where do they stand? And I'm going to give you a couple different graphs because I look at this stuff in a couple different ways. As somebody who reads a lot of polls, I generally look at polling aggregators. So this is the Huffington Post pollster average trends for both Clinton and Trump. And you can see, dating back to, as soon as the nominations were more or less set after the last primaries, the trends have been fairly stable. You see a couple variations, you see a couple dips up and down, but there's been a pretty consistent gap between the two candidates. And you see that even more clearly in this. This is probably my single favorite graph of polls that I've seen this year. And I say that because it shows you the fielding periods for each of the surveys. So you can really get a good sense of exactly what days are being covered by these polls, who they're favoring. You'll notice that there are very, very few polls in which Trump is ahead. This indicates the race is not that close. A close race, you'll see polls on both sides. You will see some that are outliers, one way or the other. If you're only seeing polls in one direction, that gives you a pretty good sense of where the average is going to be. And that comes out pretty strongly if you look at the electoral maps. So everybody loves 538. Here is their map, updated as of 6 hours ago. It's a very blue map. They're predicting Clinton to win about 340 votes, electoral votes. Trump will come in a little under 200. The final map will probably look something like this. It's pretty rare for the polls to shift that much in the last 3 weeks. There's really no evidence the polls are systematically biased. There's no evidence that we're missing something huge. Polls have been of very good quality the last several years, and we can talk about polling methods until you fall asleep if you'd like. But I have a pretty good confidence that this map will look pretty much like the final map on November 8th. So how did we get here? We got here because Donald Trump entered the GOP primary in the summer of 2015, immediately rose to first place, and never looked back. I've heard in talking to other people throughout the fall, the polls might be off because they didn't see Trump coming. They saw Trump coming. Analysts did not see Trump coming. Analysts thought Trump will be like other candidates we've seen in 2012 who rose because they were there to sell some books and they fell off once they went through that kind of scrutiny phase. Didn't happen to Trump. He got stronger, he dominated the field and won very straightforwardly, actually. On the Democratic side, not nearly as many lines, which makes the graph much less interesting, but a fairly clear trend. Clinton's support was pretty steady. Sanders grew in support throughout the primaries, but never really overtook her. And throughout the night, we're going to talk a lot about Trump and much less about Clinton supporters and Sanders supporters. We can talk about that stuff if you have a specific question that you want to get into. We generally don't talk about them because the differences aren't that interesting and there aren't very many of them. Clinton supporters and Sanders supporters don't disagree on very many issues in foreign policy, even on globalization and trade issues. There are differences of kind, but not of huge magnitude.
So yeah, this is the part of the cover from our most recent report. I'll just tell you a little bit about it. When we started writing this, well, not me personally in 1974, obviously, but when they started writing this in 1974, they would put all the data together and it was kind of a compendium. And they would put it all out, and so everything you could imagine was in there. Of course, that was a different time, and these days, we can't even get people to read a 3-page report, much less a 33 or 53-page report. And so what we're starting to do now is really slim down and focus in on one area. So rather than putting in an appendix that is everything, we try to bring out one narrative. And the narrative that we have this time around is mainly the focus of Trump and who the Trump supporters are, what they think about immigration, what they think about globalization, international trade, and how they view foreign policy. It's not all bad news for everyone. There's the good news is, what we see at the end is that there's actually a lot of overlap between Americans and how they view the role in the world, regardless of what their partisanship may be. So that is the good news. The kind of more concerning news, which is probably not a secret to anyone in this room, is that there are a lot of disagreements on some core issues, and I think we're going to see those come up in the debate tonight. I know one of the topics that's supposed to be discussed is immigration, and so we will see that coming up. The report is obviously available online, so I encourage you all to read it. We don't have that many printed copies. We're even moving away from that these days, so everything being done that way.
There's a beautiful digital interactive that our communications team prepared. You can go through that. It's got all the great highlights. Strongly encourage it.
So, methodology. We can go into more detail on this if you would like, but for here I'll just say, it was conducted in the middle of June. If this was out after we were fairly sure that Donald Trump was going to be the nominee. I don't think it was official at that point.
It wasn't official. We put it in the field right after the last set of primaries.
Right,
so we knew.
Yeah, so it was clear. We surveyed 2,061 adults across the U.S. It's a nationally representative sample, and the margin of error is plus or minus 2.38. One of the interesting things about the dates that we saw was that during just about in the middle of the polling was the attack in Orlando. And so anytime you get an event like that, as a pollster, it's very interesting to see how it's going to shift the numbers. At the time, there was a lot of discussion about what that would mean for the support of Donald Trump. The general thought was if there are attacks that are going to continue, that would shift people slowly towards him because of his hardline rhetoric on immigrants and terrorists as well. But when we looked at the data, there was actually no change. People who were voting for Trump initially or said they were going to support him were going to support him, and people who were on the Clinton side were still on the Clinton side even after that. So this narrative that attacks or other things were going to shift it never really panned out in the data, and I think that's what we've seen in other places as well. Throughout the night, we're going to talk a lot about partisan identification. We ask a very standard question. I think you can see it up there, but I'll read it anyway. Generally speaking, do you usually think of yourself as a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, or what? This is, again, standard question wording. One of the things that we don't do, at least not on this one, we actually ask it in a separate question, but we don't use it as part of our analysis. And that is people who answer as an independent, we follow up with them and ask them, well, if you had to, which way would you lean? That's fairly common. They also do that for presidential approval. Presidential approval questions, if you come down, well, I'm not sure, they ask you again. Because that is one of the most basic questions that you should be able to answer, and is generally the very first question you're asked in any kind of those. So, but for our purposes, we didn't lean people one way or the other. It was just the initial response. The survey was conducted online by GFK Custom Research, but the polling sample was not collected online. The polling sample is collected through random digit dialing, where they call a lot of people and ask them if they want to participate. They have a panel of about 50?
I think it's 50,000 now.
Yeah, 50,000 people. And then anyone who's on there can come in and then take the survey. The survey is then weighted to make sure that it's nationally representative. So the key takeaways. The first key takeaway, I think, from the report and one thing we'll hear about tonight in the immigration is that immigration is really the key. On a number of measures, we are seeing historic gaps between Republicans and Democrats on especially critical threat of immigration, things of this nature. And so that is one of the things that is going to be, I think, really pinned on tonight. People are going to talk about that a lot, and I'd expect to see probably the biggest fireworks from the debate on that, and that's kind of core to the Donald Trump supporters. One thing we'll also see is that these concerns are not new. When we look at the trend data, it's come out over about 10 years time where suddenly the Republicans actually, it's not that their support increases, it's that the Democrats and independents kind of fall off, and it creates about a 40-point gap for citing immigration as a critical threat. And for the impact of this is that in the near term, even if Trump loses this election, or whatever the outcome may be, this is not going to go away. It's taken 10 years to get to this point, and so next year it's not just going to somehow evaporate. This is going to be an ongoing issue. Now that doesn't mean that the Trump supporters maybe, or the nation, they may not, a future politician may not come out and be able to exploit it as well as Trump has, but it's certainly going to be underlying. And I wouldn't be surprised if future candidates do come out and try to exploit it, but perhaps not to the same effect.
So we are talking a lot about core supporters throughout this presentation. So let's quickly define what we mean when we're talking about core supporters. We don't just mean people who are going to vote for Trump or who are going to vote for Clinton. Most Republicans are voting for Trump and most Democrats are voting for Clinton, and that's pretty normal. Partisans vote for their party's candidate very consistently. In fact, partisan voting has been on the rise over the last several decades. It's one of the features of a growing polarized politics that we have. So on this slide, you can see basically how the different partisan preferences broke down on primary support. And by primary support, we mean who the top choice for president was for these people. So if I asked you, of all the people who ran in the primaries, who was your top choice? That answer is how we're going to define you as a core supporter of someone. Clinton, unsurprisingly, got majority support among Democrats. Interestingly, though, Trump was only the primary choice of about a third of Republicans. There was a bit of a split in the party, and you do see that playing out even today as you get the kind of fighting between the Trump campaign and more establishment Republicans snapping back and forth with each other on Twitter, in press statements, and things like that. Notably, independents do kind of split out a bit between the various candidates. I want to add on to one thing that Carl said about leaning independents one way or the other. Independents who lean Democratic or Republican look almost identical to Democrats and Republicans. They just say they're independent because being partisan isn't cool. No, if you look really deep in the data, independents who lean toward one way or another look more like strong partisans than what we would call weak partisans. If you say, oh, I'm a Democrat, or would you say you're strongly Democrat or only somewhat a Democrat? Strong Democrats look like Democratic-leaning independents. The remainder of people who don't lean one way or the other look distinctly different from everyone else, but they also generally don't pay attention to politics. If you ask them if they consume news, they're less likely to say they do. They're generally less informed about politics. They're not as engaged, and that makes sense. Yes, a question. We have a microphone, and we'll get that so that everybody who's watching online can hear you. Yes.
So my question was there any thought then, because of some people not wanting to identify themselves with a party, for the survey, just labeling it liberal versus conservative in order to try and eliminate that gap of people who don't want to be affiliated with the party or say they're affiliated with the party?
We have that question too, actually. So we have a question that asks you to put yourself on a 7-point ideology scale from extremely liberal to extremely conservative. Generally, those map onto parties pretty closely. Most Democrats are on the moderate to liberal side, and most Republicans are on the moderate to conservative side. And in fact, this is a great segue to the next slide. So we actually broke it out that way, looking at core Trump supporters. And you can see that 59% of Trump's core supporters are Republicans. About 40% of them say they're conservative and Republican. A few liberal Republicans, not many Democrats, some moderate and conservative independents. There was a lot of talk during the primary about Trump turning out new voters. This because we did see a lot more interest in the GOP primary. We saw a lot more action in the primary. Vote totals were a lot higher. But he didn't actually turn out new voters. He just turned out people who didn't usually vote in GOP primaries. They were already voters or Republican voters. They just didn't tend to show up in the primaries. Another notable point about core Trump supporters, there's been a lot made of whether this is an economic... Oh, yes, another question. Now we're having fun.
Well, it's a very brief question. What you just said, I was wondering if that also occurred in the Democratic primaries. As Bernie Sanders was gaining steam, did more Democratic voters turn out in the primaries, just like more Republican voters turned out in their primaries?
I would have to go look. I don't remember the vote totals getting as much attention on the Democratic side, but I don't know if that's because they weren't setting records or if it's because they were being overshadowed by the chaos on the other side. It was more chaotic. It's easier to predict a two-candidate race. But but I will look into that. Okay, notable point on core Trump supporters is probably their education. That's probably the thing that distinguishes them most from other Republicans. They generally, 49% of them have a high school degree or less. That's a little unusual. Only 20% of them are college graduates. About 30% of Republicans overall are college graduates. So that's kind of the one really distinguishing point. Otherwise, they look a lot like Republicans. They're white, they tend to be a little older, and their income tends to look like Republicans. In general, these people would not look out of place in the Republican Party, and that's because 59% of them are Republicans.
Can you go back one
Yes.
slide? So I want to touch on the ethnicity part of this. So if you look at that very first part, the white non-Hispanic, right, it's 88%. That's, as Craig mentioned, not very different from Republicans overall. But if you track this back through the 1970s, in 1974 it was 95%. So we've only seen a 7% decline for all Republicans for that decline in the white non-Hispanic. On the Democratic side, in 1974, it was about 85%, and now it's about 55%. And so that's something, I'm pointing that out now because that's something that's going to come up later in the slides when we look at trend data.
Yeah, it is. There's an open question that we have right now of whether some of these shifts that we've seen in the data, especially on immigration issues, are a result of voters changing their minds, or if it's an issue of voter replacement, and just showing a more diverse Democratic Party having different views on immigration. I think you're up next.
So as we start to get into the data a little bit more, one thing that all Americans agree on is critical threats facing the United States. So across the board, whether Democrat, Independent, Republicans, or core Trump supporters, international terrorism tops the list. So that is the single most critical threat facing the country. Once we move down to the core Trump supporters. You see large numbers of immigrants and refugees coming into the United States, and that is number 3 for Republicans. So there's really not that big of a difference. There's a percentage point difference, but at least it's in the top 3, and we don't see those things in the top 3 for the Democrats or the Independents. For the Democrats, North Korea's nuclear program is number 2, and for the Independents, something similar, non-proliferation concerns, also at number 2. Here, I have to pause for a shameless bit of self-promotion. Tomorrow, I'm moderating a panel on North Korea, and we're going to bring in South Korea, 4 or 5 South Korean experts, including a former ambassador who was the envoy to the 6-party talks for South Korea, along with a US expert on North Korea's illicit economy. So, hopefully, we'll see some of you back here tomorrow. Of course, I had to get that in while I can.
If I wasn't giving a talk somewhere else, I would be there.
So yeah, that's on critical threats. So we're going to focus in on, after this, on the immigrants and refugees. When we start to look at this as trend data going back to 1998, there you can see across parties, at that point, there was very little to distinguish between Democrats, Independents, and Republicans, all right around 50-55%. And what we've seen over time is a slow divergence. Right? So in 2004, it starts to diverge. And then in 2016, the gap is now at 40 percentage points. Now that is incredibly large. Anytime you're talking about asking the same question to any population and you come up with a 40 percentage point gap, it's very striking. But what I generally think about this, right, is if you look at the line, we often think, well, why are the Republicans changing like this? But it's actually not the Republicans that have changed. Their line here is almost flat, 56 and 98 to 67 in 2016. So there's an 11-point gap there, or 11-point jump. But look what's happened to the Democrats at the same time. Like there, it goes from 62 to 27. And so I mentioned previously that there's been a big shift in diversity within the Democratic Party. And I think that's what's driving it. And I haven't gone back through the data sets and run all the regressions, but it seems like that's probably what is going on, where the Republican side has not become more diverse. And so therefore their kind of views and how they view immigration has remained very steady across time. We also asked about specific immigrant groups. Here we're only showing 2 of them here, but one thing that comes out is that the core Trump supporters have the least favorable views of all immigrant groups across the board. So whether we asked about Middle Eastern immigrants in the United States, core Trump supporters favorable views at 15%, compared to a majority of Democrats, or almost probably a plurality of independents, and 40% overall. We also asked about Mexican immigrants in Mexico, and Mexican immigrants in the United States. There was actually a big gap. So Mexican immigrants in the United States, not so favorable again, especially among core Trump supporters. However, Mexican immigrants in Mexico, much more favorable towards Mexicans in Mexico, not immigrants, obviously. We also included Korean immigrants in the US and Chinese immigrants in the US. And again, it was about, favorable views were much lower among all of the core Trump supporters. What part of that question, if we look at the specific question wording, large numbers of immigrants and refugees coming into the United States. So we also asked about Syrian refugees. While most Americans are generally, if we go back here, sorry. Most Americans they may not see it as a threat, except for Republicans. On the refugee question, majorities are opposed to bringing in refugees into the United States. But again, the gap is very striking between Democrats at 40% and core Trump supporters at 90% opposed. That is a huge gap.
Yeah, in general, it's pretty rare to see 90% in our surveys. We usually top out around 80% because there's always some degree of disagreement within a party or within a political support group. And part of the thing that's driving the opposition to Syrian refugees is concern about terrorism. And in fact, one of the methods, this is part of a larger question about how the United States should combat terrorism, what methods are effective at combating terrorism. And we saw a very striking partisan divide on whether or not limiting the flow of refugees and migrants was a useful and effective way of combating terrorism. Democrats said no, Republicans and core Trump supporters said yes, as did a majority of Americans overall. We also saw a similar divide on torture, actually. This is the other issue where we've seen historically some pretty sharp divisions on fighting terror. In general, counterterrorism policy is pretty bipartisan. Americans of all political stripes favor airstrikes and drone strikes. They favor the use of special operations forces in Iraq and Syria. But on limiting the flow of refugees and on using torture, there we start to see partisan divisions between both Democrats and Republicans and between Democrats and core Trump supporters. And the final issue, and this will almost certainly come up in the debate tonight, it shockingly has not come up in either of the first two presidential debates, despite being a huge political issue that will be a major topic in 2017, basically as soon as the new Congress sits down, is immigration reform and whether or not undocumented immigrants will have a path to citizenship or whether there will be any legal status offered. And we see very striking divides even within the Republican Party on this. So 63% of core Trump supporters say that undocumented immigrants should be deported from the country, should be required to leave their jobs and the US. Only 42% of Republicans agree with that. So this is really, this is one of the issues where we do see gaps starting to emerge. 44% of Democrats, meanwhile, say they should be allowed to stay in their jobs and apply for citizenship without preconditions. If you add some preconditions, you get another 28%. But a majority of Republicans actually support allowing unauthorized immigrants to stay in the country, either with a path to citizenship or simply with legal status. This, again, we talked earlier a little bit about the divide between Trump and the Republican establishment. This is another one of those issues that's going to get right at that. This always comes up when Congress starts talking about comprehensive immigration reform. It came up in 2007. It came up in 2013 very strongly when the Senate passed immigration reform and was held up in the House. I guarantee you will see this again in 2017 and 2018. It is one of Clinton's big campaign promises. It is something that her base wants, and it is going to be a fight. Stay tuned. I mentioned divisions between, oh, we have a question, yes.
Hi, sorry. So I was wondering if, because the data was conducted after the primaries had already happened, if the views of Trump supporters could be changed by Trump himself during the primaries.
That's a very good question, and it's actually something that's on our minds when we look at the data on Russia in particular, because there have been a few other surveys looking at views of Russia and views of Vladimir Putin in particular among the American public, and they have seen some shifts on the Republican side in favorability of Russia and Putin. And that's because you now have a presidential candidate talking favorably about someone. There are a lot of theories in academia looking at how do we explain shifts in public opinion? How do we explain public attitudes on complex issues? And one of them is that they take cues from opinion leaders. If you watch the Sunday shows, if you watch even the nightly news, and you see someone in your party who you generally agree with talking about an issue that you haven't heard about before, do you agree with them or not? Personally, even if I don't have a huge background of interest in the issue, I think, oh, okay, well, I know, that person is smart on this other topic. I'll trust them on this. Maybe I'll find out more later. And if you think about how you read the news and how you consume information, I'm hoping that you're also thinking this. Otherwise, I'm just the weird person on stage. And that's why, actually, this figure also gets to your point. There's a huge gap between Republican leaders and the Republican public on this issue. This is an issue where the Republican leadership has not been able to bring all of their base along. And this is a consistent gap we've seen. This is part of a really interesting study we did in 2014, where we surveyed what we would call opinion leaders. These are people that we think would have an outsized influence on policy. They're think tank experts. They're congressional staffers. They work in executive branch agencies. They might be academics with a particular specialty in this. Business leaders who we know have a strong influence on policy. There's a huge gap between Republican leadership and their public. This is one of a few issues where we've seen this. Immigration is one, globalization is another, as is trade. 98% of Republican opinion leaders say that globalization is overall good for the US. And as Carl will tell you, that is not exactly how everyone sees it.
Yeah, so on the globalization, immigration is the core issue. Globalization, I think, is a secondary issue that is dividing in this election. And Democrats overall, 74% are going to say that globalization is good. And this is actually somewhat of a flip, I feel. Democrats traditionally are a little bit more anti-trade, because they have closer ties to the labor unions, and that's where more of their support comes from. And so we often see the Republicans who are arguing for free trade, who are arguing for internationalization. And this time, well, both of them are arguing against it. And it kind of, when you look at the Republican support for this and the core Trump supporters' support, well, you can kind of understand it because there is some support there. But when I look at this, I think, wow, 49% of core Trump supporters actually think that globalization is good. Now, I think that number is somewhat encouraging. I expected it to be much lower when we originally asked this question, especially given the stereotypes that we've heard about core Trump supporters, that they're less educated, that they're poorer. And when we broke down the demographics previously, if you look at the incomes, actually the incomes are fairly evenly distributed throughout. So here we see the Democrats, very favorable, independents very favorable, Republicans are somewhat lower. Of course, when we broke this down, we asked a series of follow-up questions about international trade. Next, we'll talk about that. But when we start to roll this back through the trend data, we asked from 98 again until 2016. Again, we see that clustering right in 98, where at that point, all of the partisans were basically together on the goodness of globalization for America. But as we kind of wind the clock forward, we see this divergence taking place. And again, while I haven't run the regressions, I think it's due to the fact that the Democratic Party has diversified in terms of its base, and the Republican Party has not. And I think that's one thing that we find relatively regularly is that people who are either immigrants or minorities, they have much more favorable views towards trade, towards immigration, and on a whole range of issues. And so we see that coming out in the Democratic Party. Meanwhile, the Republican Party has not diversified, and so their trend line essentially stays flat. You can see there 57% in 1998 and 59% in 2016, with a high of 65. So very, very little variation on that.
Oh, we got a question.
I was wondering if you guys wouldn't mind commenting on how likely you think, I was reading about Bradley effect or a Wilder effect is in this election, meaning are people perhaps underreporting to pollsters or support for Trump? And what makes me wonder about it is, at least as I remember for Brexit, is right before the vote, everyone was saying it was going to be close, but people would vote to stay in. Is there any chance you think that we're seeing a underrepresentation of actual Trump support in the polls? Because of a normative bias, people are saying, I'm not going to tell them I'm voting for Trump, but I'm going to go in there and pull the lever for Trump.
Yeah, the social desirability bias, that's something that all pollsters are generally thinking about. The social desirability bias is something that, when you have any interaction with a person, you are going to kind of moderate yourself. You may have very extreme views, But anytime someone asks you, you'll naturally step back from that. And that can even be introduced by someone calling you on the telephone. Right? Just another voice will introduce that, or is possible to introduce that effect. How do you get at measuring that? Of course, Trump has claimed that people, it's kind of astonishing that he is claiming that people are embarrassed to vote for him. but that's kind of what he said recently. And so how do you get at measuring that? I'm not exactly sure. Do I believe that could be introduced? Yeah, maybe he'll overperform the last poll, but I can't imagine that it's going to be by much. I know that Craig has thoughts on the Brexit polling.
Yeah, so on desirability bias, I think if this was happening, you would see distinct differences between different polling methodologies. So not all surveys that you see are conducted in the same way. Some of them are done with robocalls. Some of them are done with live interviewers. Some of them, like ours, are done online, where there's no human interaction. So if you were seeing a consistent difference in the different types of fielding, then there'd be really good evidence for desirability bias. This is kind of the shy Trump supporter theory. That said, I've never seen like a 10-point social desirability bias for voting. On Brexit is actually a really interesting example. Brexit is a case where the poll showed a very close race, but Leave was on average ahead. And again, the pundits thought, oh, well, they'll come to their senses. They won't really do it. They won't pull the trigger. If it's a close race and it looks like it's going to be tied, interpreting beyond that gets pretty tricky. It's a little bit like, now there have been polling errors in the UK before. The 2014 election, I think, in the UK was badly polled. It's a little tricky when you have multiple parties competing for first past the post districts. I understand that. But they have gotten better. I think they were more or less accurate on Brexit. But that is sort of the thing that people point to. And they say, oh, well, now we're concerned. What if the polls are wrong again? I don't think these polls are wrong. I think they're pretty accurate. I also think polling in the US is a little bit better than in the UK. Work? All right.
All right, back to international trade.
The hot topic.
Oh, I thought that was a hand going up. Nope, just scratching the head. So yeah, back on international trade, we asked this kind of series of follow-up questions about why this is kind of related to the globalization, why they think that these things are good. And we asked, is it good for consumers like you? And across the board, 70% are going to say, yes, it's good for consumers like me. Good for standards of living. Generally good for the US economy. Generally good for American companies. But everyone starts to go negative, or at least minorities start to say that, or less than majorities say that it's good for creating jobs in the US and job security for American workers. I think one of the surprising things is that there's a little bit of a gap. You have about between Democrats and core Trump supporters, 47 and 30%. Yeah, so there's a gap there, but I think the larger lesson is that Americans overall are not positive on those things. And finally, we have one specific example. I'm not sure how perhaps everyone is familiar with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's a trade deal that's negotiated between 12 Pacific countries, the US included. And right now the negotiations are finished. It's basically awaiting ratification, but it's probably not going to happen in the Obama administration for a number of reasons that we won't get into here. And if you were paying attention, this was kind of a core issue that came out between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders was very opposed to this deal from the beginning, and then later Clinton kind of moved towards his position and adopted and said, I think the quote was, she was against the TPP before she was elected, she'll be against the TPP after she's elected. But it's really confusing when you look at the polls to try to figure out that position is based on public opinion, because obviously it's not. When we look at Democrats, 71% report that they support the TPP and support the passage of that. I think if you look at the data overall, that makes a lot of sense, because we see that they're more favorable towards a host of issues on trade and globalization. But we also have the Republicans also coming out against it, and it makes a little more sense for them. But again, this is a bit of a flip-flop in terms of parties, where if you're going to pass a trade bill through Congress, you have to have Republican support, even though the Republican public is much less favorable than it is than is the Democratic Republic.
And this is the one point where I'm going to bring up Clinton and Sanders' differences. There is a 17-point difference between Clinton supporters and Sanders supporters on the TPP. 73% of core Clinton supporters back the TPP, as do 56% of Sanders supporters. That is probably one of the top 3 shocking things I found in this survey.
Well, you kind of already addressed the question I was going to ask, but I was just going to ask how you reconcile this data, which shows that Democrats are overwhelmingly in favor of TPP with the political reality that Hillary Clinton shifted her position, and it was widely attributed to have cost her support, particularly in the Michigan primary upset, which Bernie Sanders won.
So this gets to an issue of, like political economy issues. So what model do you think is driving debates on issues? In this case, interest groups play a huge role in trade policy. That's true on the Republican side. Obviously, business groups have a very distinct interest in the very particular details of trade policy. It's also true on the Democratic side. Environmental groups, labor groups have very strong beliefs about various aspects of trade, including on the TPP. A huge part of the debate on the Democratic side on TPP has been about labor standards, environmental standards, and IP concerns about regulating medicine in developing countries. So this is also a question of issue intensity. The benefits of trade are kind of very broadly distributed, and the costs are very narrowly impacted. That might work out okay if you distribute the benefits of trade evenly, or more evenly, and you do something to help people who have been hurt by trade. But until then, the people who are concerned they're going to get hurt by trade, they care a lot. It doesn't really help me that much if the price of a cup of coffee goes down 5 cents. It really matters if I lose my job. So I have a much greater incentive to go out and campaign against something that I think might hurt me that much. I think that's what we see in the political process. Also, the fact that labor unions are the turnout mechanism for Democratic candidates across the country. They're the people that are going to go and knock on doors. They're the people that are going to really turn out the vote. Their core constituency. All right, but we've been talking a lot about partisan divides and things that are going to make you very pessimistic about the future of this country and the prospect for getting anything done after the election. But there is some good news, and I'm here to give it to you. The good news is that U.S. foreign policy issues, the big U.S. foreign policy issues, are generally still bipartisan. Americans still believe that NATO is essential for U.S. security, and they support the U.S. commitment to NATO, despite all the rhetoric we've heard. Americans still favor the U.S. taking an active part in world affairs. They still think maintaining military superiority is an effective method to achieve our foreign policy goals. And as Carl showed you earlier in the presentation, there's some general consensus on some of those top goals: combating terrorism and preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. The polarization on foreign policy issues is more or less limited to immigration and globalization. Those are the ones where we really see strong differences between the parties. So for example, let's look at NATO. If you told me 2 years ago that NATO would be a major campaign issue, I'd have thought you were pulling my leg. But here we are. And NATO is a huge campaign issue, and this got a lot of attention. But even Donald Trump's core supporters think that we should keep or increase our commitment to NATO. There's just not that much support for pulling out of NATO. There's just not that much support for withdrawing our bases from the world or withdrawing from the world more generally. I would note that Democrats have actually been trending upward even faster on NATO than I had thought. 81% of Democrats today say that NATO is essential for U.S. security, compared to 57% in 2002. Republicans and independents have actually stayed pretty flat on that. They're about where they were 15 years ago. And here's another this is one of our kind of go-to questions. Whenever we get the data, this is literally the first question we look at, because this is our barometer for how the public is feeling about international engagement in a very broad sense. Do you think it's best for the future of the country if we take an active part in world affairs, or if we stay out of world affairs? Consistently, going back to 1974, we've seen majorities of Americans, from Republicans, Democrats, Independents, saying, no, we do want to take an active part. The one exception I'll point out is in 1982, only 49% of Democrats wanted to take an active part. But otherwise, you're looking at, again, fairly flat lines. In some ways, that makes the graph uninteresting to look at, but it's actually a fascinating finding that over 42 years of polls, and we found very consistent results.
So we're starting to butt up into the Q&A time, so we'll move quickly through the last few. We mentioned that Americans are pretty much together on foreign policy goals. So maintaining U.S. military superiority, we're going to see big majorities on that. Maintaining existing alliances, building new alliances, again, big majorities. The big difference comes between Democrats and Republicans about how the U.S. is going to act on the international stage in terms of strengthening the United Nations and signing international agreements. For those two things in particular, Trump supporters, core Trump supporters, and Republicans are going to lag a little bit behind. But even there, if you look at it, it's still majorities who support that. And that's quite different from the rhetoric we've heard, where we're hearing Donald Trump say that we need to pull out of these things. We really need to reconsider if they're not going to pay their fair share. And in fairness, saying that someone should pay their fair share is not the same as saying we should pull back altogether. Just to be clear on that. He singled out several allies in particular, NATO, which we've already talked about, but also Japan and South Korea. He singled them out especially for being free-riding allies. And when we look at the data on this, when we asked the American public, should we still maintain these bases, it's quite striking that it's core Trump supporters and Republicans who are most in favor of maintaining those bases. And for the record, the Asian allies do really pay their fair share. So currently in South Korea, it's about $866 million, so almost $1 billion per year that they pay to station U.S. troops there, and it's about double that for Japan. So in both cases, about 50% of the total cost. So they are certainly paying their fair share. When it comes to NATO, yes, everyone could do more. But it is striking that he's been saying these things and saying them repeatedly, but they really haven't had any effect on even his own supporters and how they view U.S. alliances around the world. And I think we'll finish up here. Of course, the big campaign slogan has been "Make America Great Again." We actually asked that question. And what we found, the question was essentially, is America the greatest country in the world or not? And majorities of everyone, and including, I think, core Trump supporters may have been at the top of this, they said, yes, America is the greatest country in the world. Which, of course, begs the question, then, if it's already the greatest country in the world, how do you make it greater? So, yeah. And
you can always go to 11.
It would always go to 11. And so we see this as well when we look at views of global influence. U.S. continues to be seen as the most influential country in the world. China trended up for some time, but has since kind of receded. But other than that, I don't think we're going to see much change in these trend lines in the future. So with that, we will turn it over to Q&A.
Yeah. Great. Anybody who's been harboring questions as they've been chatting? Got like 15 more minutes for a deep dive. Right here.
So, considering that immigration is one of the main issues, were you able to find any data for Trump supporters and their opinions on white-collar immigration, specifically for STEM professionals?
That was not in our survey this year. Well, we did have a question that was not about unauthorized immigration, and that was about legal immigration. Should the United States increase, decrease, or keep the same level of legal immigration? And I actually have the data with me. Let me pull it out for you. But I will tell you that concerns about immigration do extend to legal immigration as well. It's not simply about the legality of it. So overall, 41% of Americans say that legal immigration should be kept at the present level, 39% favor decreases, 18% favor increases. Among core Trump supporters, 70% say that legal immigration should be decreased. Only 21% support maintaining it at the present level, 9% want to increase it. So concerns about immigration for Trump supporters do go beyond the legal and illegal difference. Differences are also there for Republicans and Democrats, but they're not nearly as sharp. 53% of Republicans want to decrease legal immigration, while 49% of Democrats want to keep it at the present level, and another 24% want to increase it.
Great. Right here.
So I was just wondering, given the differences that we saw in the views of core Trump supporters and Republican supporters, what exactly does that tell us? Does it tell us that Trump might not really be a Republican at all, or at least to a significant extent, or maybe it means that he's made his own party, or that he's a third party, and I'm just wondering what that could tell us potentially about the success of third parties in U.S. elections.
So I don't know about success of third parties, but I will say that when we noted the differences between Republicans and core Trump supporters, oftentimes it was a difference in intensity, right? Where we had majorities of Republicans and more majorities of core Trump supporters. And those are on the things we had here. But on a host of other issues that we didn't report here, they're actually very close. And so I think this is something that the Republican Party has tried to avoid in saying that, well, Trump is something different. He's not us. But in a lot of ways, he is. He's very close to the Republican Party on a lot of issues. And you haven't seen, the people who supported, if they were supporting Rubio or they were supporting Cruz in their primary selection, they're now supporting Trump. And the reason for that is because there was a lot of overlap in basic positions from the beginning. It's just that they happened to support a different candidate at that time.
In the exit polling during the Republican primaries, we looked at what issues mattered to which voters, and immigration was the key for Trump supporters. If you cared about immigration, if that was your top voting issue, more likely than not, you voted for Trump. And I think that shows up in the data here. While other Republicans may be concerned about immigration, for Trump supporters, it's really a crisis. It is their top concern. As for third parties, there are structural reasons why third parties don't work in the US. I think you've seen, this would be a good year for a third party in some ways, right? You have two very unpopular presidential nominees. If any year would produce a third party running, this might be it. There was some talk certainly of Bloomberg getting in the race, but the US political system is not set up to accommodate third parties. We would really need to move to a parliamentary system for that to work out well. There is a broader question, though, about what happens to Trump and Trump's supporters after the election if Trump loses. And this is going to be an ongoing debate. You're going to read a lot of great think pieces written by magazine writers about Trumpism after Trump.
I've already read too many of them.
Yes. We will probably write some ourselves. There's probably going to be a knockdown, drag-out fight in the Republican Party between people who supported Trump and people who didn't, between the never-Trumpers and the diehard Trumpers. What that looks like, practically speaking, is kind of hard to tell. We haven't seen people running on a Trumpish platform beat GOP candidates in the primary this year. McCain obviously was concerned about a primary challenge in Arizona, but he won. There was some talk that somebody would try to unseat Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan crushed him. We just haven't, there's certainly an anger among some Trump supporters that the Republican establishment is not backing him to the hilt, but we haven't seen that translated into political action. So whether that will translate in the future is kind of up in the air. I'm a little hesitant to say that it'll be a huge force because the things you would need to do to make Trumpism a potent political force are the things that you would also need to do to run a very strong political campaign. And that hasn't really happened this year. There's been a notable lack of organization on the Republican side at the presidential level, just in terms of putting up field offices and building a ground game. And those are things you have to do if you want to create a mass movement.
Hi, so I noticed some of the questions that were asked were kind of specific, and so I was wondering, especially considering a lot of Trump supporters aren't necessarily well educated, how sort of they would have an opinion on something like military bases in Australia or other specific issues.
So yeah, the specificity issue is always a bit of a challenge. On the TPP question, that also comes to mind. In the specific question wording, it might have been a little small, and if you're sitting far away, a little difficult to read. But we do lay out within the question what it is. It's a trade agreement between 12 countries, and we try to give as much detail as we think is possible. So it's always a bit of a challenge. You never want to give too much information because you can sway responses. I think the best example of that is the Iran deal. Right? There was several polling results that came out where if you just asked the public what they thought about the Iran deal, they were generally opposed to it when it was just fresh and had just been kind of signed. But if you went back to a different sample and gave them more information, saying that this is the agreement, these are the terms, Iran is going to suspend its nuclear program, then it flipped from majority opposition to majority support. And so you do have to be very consider that very carefully when you write the questions. But yeah, it's an open question about how you sway them and the knowledge level of the respondent.
One of the interesting things for me is that people do seem to make differentiations on these complex issues. So on the international trade question, for example, the general economic theory of trade is that it's good for the US economy and it's good for consumers, but it might be bad for your job security, right? And that actually comes across very clearly in the polling. Americans do say it's good for the economy, and they do say it's good for them as consumers, but they are concerned about the effects on job security and what it means for American workers. So I think even people who don't necessarily have college education do have an appreciation of some of these more nuanced things. Even on the Australia basing, right? It's lower than for Japan and South Korea, which tells me that to me that signifies that they are thinking through something. Otherwise, you'd just be getting the same result for all the countries no matter what.
Right, and as you think through that question, especially on Australia, so the base in Australia is only 2,500 and it's off on Darwin Island essentially. And so it's because it's so new and because there's no immediate threat to Australia, and that's why you see. So anytime you ask a question and you can kind of think through the response or how someone would get to that response, then I'm not so worried about the result. Right, so even if it is somewhat specific and you can kind of piece it together how they would get there and why there's a difference between Australia bases and Japan and South Korea bases, which are facing the North Korea threat. By the way, did I tell you I'm hosting an event tomorrow on North Korea?
Shameless plug number 2.
Shameless plug number 2, the last one, I promise. But yeah, so if you look at that, then you get this idea that, okay, there is a process going on and there is a way that they're formulating their responses.
Can I ask? Oh, okay, there are people. You see, guys, I get excited. I have a microphone. I want to ask questions, too. Right here in the back.
Hi, I was just wondering if you had any thoughts, maybe any questions, or just your own thoughts on what the turnout will look like this year, just in general, and then for each party, and how that will affect, I guess, the outcome.
That is a good question. So one of the good jokes on Twitter has been that this entire race has been rigged up by political scientists to test theories. One of those theories is about campaigns. So in general, political science literature says that campaigns don't matter because they cancel each other out. Both parties will run a similar campaign with similar funding, with similar effectiveness, and so the effects are just a wash. That's definitely not going to be the case this year. The Clinton campaign has spent a ton of money building a very extensive ground game. They have field offices all over the place. It's actually not as extensive as Obama's 2008 or 2012 operation in terms of just office placement, but they definitely have the money to hire the staff. And that hasn't really been done for Trump's campaign. Hiring staff in competitive states does take some time. They got to it pretty late, and so we could actually see campaign effects matter this election. As for whether the turnout will be high or low, I don't know. Maybe Trump supporters are just so motivated by the candidate that they will turn out even though there isn't necessarily the ground operation to remind them to go vote. It's possible. It's not necessarily that likely, but it is possible.
Yeah, I would be surprised if turnout was surprised on the upside, especially because more recent polls they've asked, who do you expect to win? And even a majority of Trump supporters now expect Hillary Clinton to win. So if that's the case, then that will certainly, I would expect it to depress turnout.
There's also some evidence that claims of vote rigging depress turnout, even on your side. If you think your vote is just going to be washed away in a grand conspiracy, then why bother to wait in line to vote? And also, people are not particularly enthusiastic this election. These are two candidates with very low favorability ratings. This is not a race between two really popular people, where people are really excited to go out and vote. And that's not true for everyone. There are some people who are very excited to go vote on both sides, but overall, lower.
Right here in the middle.
What impact does public opinion have on actual foreign policy and actual foreign engagement after the election? I mean, some of these issues have been issues since 1998 and earlier.
So I think that public opinion sets the boundaries of what is acceptable and what is not. Right? So it may not have a real heavy influence unless it's a very hot topic, but generally it just sets the boundaries. So if you're thinking about policy towards North Korea. Not a shameless plug, by the way. But if you're thinking about that, then there are certain things that the public's going to accept, right? So, if we're looking at that, the least accepted option in dealing with North Korea is to do nothing and simply allow North Korea to continue to build nuclear weapons. Diplomacy is supported by like 70 to 80%, and even airstrikes or sending in U.S. troops to forcibly denuclearize North Korea is about 35 to 40%, right? So, there are a whole host of issues that come with that, but it just sets the boundaries for what's going to be available to the president.
Yes. The issue of how public opinion affects foreign policy making is really complicated. Mostly, in part because the foreign policy making of the U.S. is an incredibly complex apparatus, and it's mostly a black box. You can see a lot of things going into it, you can see a lot of inputs, and then you get an output, and you're not entirely sure how that sausage got made. We do know that people in policy roles read opinion surveys. We know that opinion surveys are one of the kinds of research they find most useful because it is helpful for them to know what the politics are. If they're about to go out and propose a new policy that turns out to be incredibly unpopular, they want to know that before they do it so they can reframe the message, so they can craft something that's going to sit better with the public. After all, these are politicians running the show. That's my 2 cents on public opinion and foreign policy.
That's a really interesting, if I can just piggyback off of that, because something that's striking to me about the survey and tangential to your question is that the absence of some key policy issues that we know are at the forefront of national policy as set by the policymakers, one of them being cybersecurity. I'm surprised that that doesn't come up more in this survey, and maybe we're not, and part of me thinks that that's because we're not talking about it a lot. Right now we're talking about, I guess, in the context of Russia a little bit, but in general, it's not one of these hot button issues that's been raised by either campaign. And yet we know it's a major priority of the Department of Defense and the national intelligence community.
Yeah, and I think over time that will become more important, right? It's such a complex issue and it's kind of this dark matter that no one is quite sure what it means, and they only hear about it when something goes wrong. So kind of the day-to-day basis of what it takes to do cybersecurity and how the U.S. government is handling it, that's people are just not really thinking about it. They're more thinking about it in terms of identity theft, but that's not, a national issue. I think over time, people who are growing up now and are thinking about it more and are more in tune, it's going to become a bigger and bigger issue as we move forward.
We did include cyber attacks as a critical threat question in our 2015 survey, and it came out very high. It was I think it was in number 1 or number 2. So it is on people's minds to some extent. We do also include it in some of our batteries about how to deal with threatening countries. I believe it's in our North Korea battery, whether or not we should conduct cyber attacks against North Korea's nuclear infrastructure. Yeah. And we asked about Iran in a similar context in 2015. And it comes out about it comes out a little higher than you would see airstrikes. So there's more support for that sort of covert cyber operation than you would see for an airstrike.
Interesting. Great. Right up front, please.
On that topic, does it matter if you would call it cybersecurity, which I think people think of as protecting their credit and their identity, versus cyber terrorism, which sounds much more threatening?
Cyber terrorism would certainly elicit higher responses, I'm sure.
Yeah. Anytime you make the thing sound more threatening, you're going to get a more response.
Makes sense. All right, last question. I'm sorry, right here on the side. And then Carl and
We'll be
Craig,
here
you guys
after,
going to
don't
stay
worry.
and hang out for
Yeah,
a little
we'll be
while. So
around.
any questions not answered yet, we'll be able to talk during the debate and dinner.
So you noted that over the past few years, immigration among Republicans has actually stayed pretty steady, while you saw a market difference among Democrats. I was wondering if that was also true for the importance of it for Republicans. And so the real question is, we see it in this election as being a major issue that people are talking about. Is that a result purely of the gap between opinions in Republicans and Democrats, or is it also a more important issue for Republicans?
My initial guess is that issue salience is going to play a role here, and that the issue has become more important. It's being talked about more. And one of the things that we note in our report, I think we noted in our report, that Americans are essentially white Americans are essentially on their way to becoming minorities, right? So it's something by before 2040 or around that time that they'll go from being majority to minority. And so you're already starting to see those concerns play out, where some people would prefer to see the country stay where it is now?
It has, I mean, it's an unusually salient issue this year. It's come up more than you might expect. But it's been a fairly big issue in past campaigns too. Immigration reform was one of the promises that Obama made in 2008. And a lot of immigration reform activists were very, very angry that that did not happen, that health reform took priority over immigration reform. A lot of them saw that as a really serious betrayal. I think you saw the politics of this also come up during the Bush administration when they tried to pass reform in 2007. They got a lot of very angry pushback from their base. It did not sit well with them. It's definitely been an issue out there. I don't see it going away anytime soon. I expect it'll be just as big an issue in 2020.
Well, Carl and Craig, certainly a lot here to dig into with the survey and an interesting context with which we enter this third and final debate. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking our speakers tonight.